Greetings, fellow humans. I am Hugh.
And I am Man.
And together we are definitely not
Two
kobolds in a trench coat. We enjoy human activities, such as paying taxes,
having existential crises,
and RPG horror stories. Let's see what we've got today.
Today, we have a DM who forces their players into death loops that can only be broken by his DM PCs, and a DM who freaks out over other languages being spoken.
DM traps players in a death loop cycle and forces players to babysit evil DM PCs, by Reddit user AlexTheOx82. Hey everyone, I'm new to the community here, although I've been listening to RPG horror stories all the time from different YouTubers. Hopefully including your favourite kobolds.
Humans.
Yes, human, singular.
Yes, your fellow human.
No kobolds.
No, absolutely zero.
I have a cautionary tale here about what happens when a fledgling DM doesn't take advice well, and when they try to railroad players. I hope you enjoy. Let the pain commence. The story begins when I introduced a good friend of mine at the time to D&D, a friend we will call Caster. It was Caster who introduced me to a few others interested in D&D like he was, and so we forged a group of 6 to 7 people together, all except me new to the game and eager to learn the thrills of the TTRPG. I have 6 years experience as a player and 3 as a DM, so I made an adventure that ended up lasting for years, all of which the party was eager to play and grow in their first characters. Caster had some occasional things he needed to work on. I can share more stories later here if you want. But for the most part, he took to D&D well, and ended up surprising me with a revelation I would later look back on with some regret. At some point, Caster revealed to me he wanted to make his own campaign, and turned to me for guidance. We would hang out many times outside of D&D in order to help him build his world. Sometimes I would listen for a few hours and give little ideas or tweaks, other times I would become a more active collaborator in his world building. As an avid D&D fan, I was beyond ecstatic to see a player of mine growing and starting a campaign of their own, and I couldn't wait to play it. Before I go any further, I just want to say I knew Caster's campaign would be a little rough around the edges. As someone with more experience as a DM and a player, I could tell Caster would need some guidance with the technical aspect of running his game, and he was actually agreeable with this, asking for guidance sometimes and wanting feedback at the end of the session. That being said, I was not prepared for what I am about to share with you.
I have to commend OP's very positive attitude here of being like, yeah, absolutely, let me help you, let's nurture and grow together. I think that's so great, just that collaborative attitude.
Sounds very typical of when a player in the group wants to try their hand at DMing first time. It is quite common to lean on the most experienced player in the group, or rather the most experienced DM in the group, to get you going. Actually pretty positive so far.
And let's be fair, so many DMs end up being forever DMs. I'm sure OP was like, oh hell yeah, I get to be a player again.
The Session 0 was really cool, with everyone rolling up some interesting characters. A rogue assassin on the run, a child bard with a broken home, a druidic adventurer with a broken home, and my character, a one-armed human fighter looking to avenge his dead wife. The first problem came up in the first session when the story started with a TPK via a red dragon before our first dice roll. Before the journey started, we were all dead. Caster used this to introduce us to a mechanic where TPKs would result in the time rewind, similar to some anime he was really fond of. I remember him talking about this before we were hanging out, but I expressed to him that it may not be the best idea to use. In hindsight, I should have been more firm about this, but here we were, reviving an hour before and told by the DM we needed to figure a way not to die again.
Okay, so it's an interesting concept. This idea of a TPK means the timeline gets reset. I kind of like it. I don't know, it's interesting. It's just interesting to me.
It's definitely an interesting concept, but I think it's something a rookie DM should steer clear of and definitely requires a more experienced hand.
And I also think it's something that should have been discussed in session 0 rather than just thrown at them. If you're going along, all of a sudden everybody's dead. Anytime you have unusual mechanics, especially around death, it's just always a good idea to tell your players about it ahead of time.
Yeah, it's a special kind of campaign that the players definitely should have been aware they were going into beforehand. In some ways, it was an interesting way to run the plot, but more often than not, it would lead us to fighting overpowered enemies with encounters that weren't balanced correctly. After the first 2 to 3 death battles, as I would call them, Caster was agreeable and balanced the encounters. But after this point, he would argue and say that since TPKs just meant a reset in time and not permadeath, he didn't need to balance the game, and coming back each time may give us clues and new opportunities to beat the tougher opponents. This problem would then lead to Caster not wanting to engage us in combat at all at some point, as I could tell he was having some trouble with balancing. I asked about this a few times and offered to help, but he kept insisting we would reach combat. Even though if we ever tried to initiate combat, some NPCs or other outside circumstances would shut it down unless it was highly choreographed battle Caster planned. Unless it was a highly choreographed battle Caster had planned. And then came the twins. The DM had a pair of DMPCs in the form of young vampiric children, 2 vampire twins inspired by an anime he enjoyed. The twins were abused in a horrible variety of ways I will not mention, and because of their trauma, they were psychotic killing machines who could coat their weapons in blood and wield them in a heightened state of power that made them ridiculously OP. I remember one time I asked him to see their character sheets, and he refused, only letting me know that they were level 20s, a pair of literal little monsters. There was a questline I remember Caster was the most excited to have us play out, a criminal questline where we help this gnome criminal overlord unite various bandit nations and small groups of civil unrest unite under his wing, a point which the gnome justified that there would always be crime in this world, and as long as he could control it, the world would be a better place. The twins of course were a big part of it, as they were practically pets of the gnome guy and his most loyal followers, him acting as a sort of strange surrogate father to them. These 2 elements combining together meant that we would often encounter these 2 NPCs, having them come in and sweep up the mess if a combat encounter had us TPK 2 to 3 times. They would just randomly show up, erase every threat, and contrive an excuse as to how they got there. The whole party talked to Caster about this at some point, saying we didn't want to babysit his OP twins, but he ended up taking us in the opposite direction. He had us babysit them.
I don't know why it is, but DMPCs just always end up being problematic.
This really in particular just defeats the purpose of the rewind and then getting to figure out new ways to solve the problem, if after a couple of times he's just gonna solve it for them.
It's almost like what's even the point of the game? I mean, I would start to feel that way if it was me. He's not going to balance combat. He's already said he doesn't want to have to balance combat. If we get TPK'd a couple times, then his DMPCs are going to come in and save the day. So literally, what is the point of any of it? The party is not growing and learning. The party is not figuring this stuff out on their own. They're just gliding through the campaign.
Yeah, that concept of player agency just goes completely out the window. Why are they even there? Perhaps out of kindness or maybe survival instinct? Who would want to fight a level 20 vampire child as a level 3 or 4? The party would be nice to the children and show them kindness, which would offer nice little glimpses into their lost humanity. That being said, the gnome guy used this as an opportunity to rein us into his criminal syndicate, offering us whatever we saw and saying the children liked us. My character was a lawful neutral guy, understanding the point of law and order, and trying to be the best to the most decent folk, but not afraid to break rules and do dirty work if it was for the greater good.
The greater good.
That being said, my character was not interested in joining the Gnome Syndicate, so my screen time was cut drastically in a lot of areas, other times having my guy sent on random missions that most of us could tell were busy work. I asked Caster if there was some other angle I could work, and he did, but not in the way I hoped for. He ended up resurrecting my character's dead wife and making her an evil NPC that walked around like a Grim Reaper ripoff, complete with dark armor and scythe. I wasn't asked about that until later on, but by then I didn't want to stifle his creativity and went along with it. Though I should have told him my apprehensions. Now my character's wife was some sort of dark evil spirit. Yay.
I totally understand where you're coming from, OP, not wanting to stifle the DM's creativity. However, I feel like the creativity is kind of getting out of hand at this point and is turning into like a railroad to creativity city. No longer do you have really any player agency. He's just doing whatever he wants to. And yeah, sure, it's interesting, but like, is it really a D&D campaign anymore?
No, not really. This is definitely a classic case of should have written a book. It can be fun when DMs do decide aspects of your backstory, but generally that's only with player permission. At this time, the child bard, controlled by a player I will call Hyper, was beginning to hang around with the twins more outside of missions, which had me worried due to some outside events. See, Caster had an IRL crush on Hyper, and was beginning to act strange around her. Getting to the point he would literally try to always be next to her and sometimes mimic her actions and try to copy her personality to get her to notice him. We called him out on this, and he feigned innocence while simultaneously apologising. This put aside Caster's strange actions against Hyper IRL, though he has more instances of doing this with other women at the table. I can share more later. But Hyper's bard was not the best pal of the vampire twins, and she got all the screen time for a while. There was a time the party split, with some of us seeking for more information in a new town about various guild merchants and looking for answers to rumours of a criminal presence in the new town. This got 1/3 of the session screen time, with the other 2/3 dedicated to Hyper's character, another female character, and the twins going to a candy shop. Inexplicably doted upon by the shop owner and given tons of free candy samples to try. So here we were, with one half of the party put on hold to watch the other half eat candy. This wasn't the worst of it, however. When the twins would follow us around, they would no longer help us in combat. The DM took to heart we didn't want to be babied in combat, yet anytime there was a chance for them to fight, which it was established they loved to kill, they would just leave combat and hang back, doing childish shenanigans and watching us die time after time, not even lifting a finger if we asked for help. On top of that, there was a point where the party members who joined the syndicate, I remained firm if not joining despite feeling railroaded to help by the fact that the gnome was our only quest giver, had to go talk to the gnome and turn in a quest. There was a little flavour moment of the twins in their own room, playing with toys and hanging out, and of course, Hyper wanted to see what was going on. For 30 minutes to an hour, we all watched in confusion as the campaign was put on pause for Hyper, a random girl NPC, and the twins to all play toy dragons and ships in their room. I wish I could say the story has a good end, but it does not. I apologise for how scatterbrained it was, but as you can tell, things did get a bit derailed as time went on in order to force us to be around the DM's preferred NPCs. At some point, there was a falling out in the group IRL due to some things I will not talk about here, and the game sort of fizzled out. I hope you all enjoyed the story. TLDR, I introduced a group of friends to D&D, with one of them starting up their own campaign. The new DM put everyone in a death mechanic where TPKs rewinded progress, forcing people to replay scenes and battles against their will. DM also introduced the party to his DMPCs, a pair of OP vampire twins that the whole world slowly began to revolve around. Session moments involving actual quest work and plot relevant details were put on hold to watch DMPCs eat at a candy store and play in their bedroom. Also, DM brought back my dead wife as an evil monster without consent.
Alright, well, the term lost the plot really comes to mind in hearing this story.
That plot was lost in a freaking labyrinth.
I don't know if it was because the DM got so fixated on Hyper and the whole relationship with them and his DMPCs. At some point, it just seems that they just didn't have any direction whatsoever.
To my mind, the DM clearly didn't understand this is about the player's adventure and got much more obsessed with his own world. Except for when he was obsessing over whichever girl he was crushing on at that moment.
I think this story very well exemplifies why having a sort of a timeline reset after death is not a good idea for D&D. It works in a video game, but in D&D, it just gets frustrating for players.
It's definitely a veteran DM mechanic. You've got to balance everything finely to the point where the first time the encounter is probably going to kill them, but there are potentially things they could learn from that to get over it the next time or the time after that around. It requires a master storyteller, not a first-time DM.
No, absolutely not, because basically what the DM then did was use it as an excuse to not balance anything whatsoever, because they were just going to come back and eventually figure it out, whereas NPCs would swoop in and save the day. I left a campaign because I wasn't allowed to speak multiple languages, by Reddit user bilingualmenace-IG. This happened a few years ago now, and I've decided to share it now since my TTRPG experience has been pretty great since. It was my first time ever playing D&D, and I got invited by quite literally a friend of a friend. In this specific situation, this girl, let's call her Sarah, invited my best friend, I'll call her Haley, and I to join her friend, David's, new campaign he wanted to start. Players would then be Sarah, Haley, me, and this other girl who could only join us every few sessions due to her busy schedule. She's not important, and David was going to DM. Now, 2 things are important to note here. 1, this was not only Haley and I's first time playing, but it's also our first ever interaction with D&D. We knew nothing about it, hadn't watched anything explaining the game, nothing, total newbie, which the other players in the DM were aware of and okay with. We live in an area that is mostly French-speaking, but Haley and I are both bilingual, so for the past 20 years, we've known each other. We've often spoken with each other's using both French and English, sometimes switching between both languages in the middle of a sentence. Back to the story. The sessions were going to happen over Zoom calls as we lived in a different city. In the group chat we created, David welcomed us and then immediately told us that we needed to create characters. He did not tell us how to do such a task and insisted that we use the PDF version of the player's handbook, which was in English, by the way, and important for later, and said to DM him with questions if needed. Now, as most of you know, the player's handbook is very extensive and very overwhelming to newcomers, so you can imagine that my best friend and I were left a little shocked with the lack of directions. We did our best and created characters that we were proud of. For the first session, session 0, Haley came over to my place so that we could do the Zoom call together and maybe help each other out.
Yeah, that's poor form. You got brand new players, you should definitely help them through creating their first character if you can. The player's handbook is very overwhelming. It's not as overwhelming as the entirety of the material, don't even go there if you're new. But any decent DM should give them a bit of guidance with that. At the very least, roll the stats with them.
Don't just throw the handbook at them and be like, hey, hi, figure it out, have fun, bye.
Also, don't throw the handbook at people. It's heavy, sharp corners. That would end badly.
David led us through the rest of our character creations by making us roll our stats. He would tell us the dice to roll, not explain why we were rolling it, make us tell him our number, and then he would tell us what to write where in a very robotic voice, yet again never explaining it or why we were doing it. I tried asking him more questions, but he brushed it off, saying we'd come back to it later. We never did. After our character sheets were filled, we went right into the story. He didn't explain anything else and told us just to act and do things our characters would do, and then get mad if we didn't answer or act quickly enough. Keep in mind that this game was being played in French. We were all speaking in French with each other, but the process was also extremely confusing to Haley and me since nothing was being explained to us. So every time we got confused, we'd sometimes ask each other questions using our normal way of speaking, aka a mix of French and English, and that would absolutely piss off the DM. He kept saying that we were in a French area, therefore we should be speaking French, and we need to stop saying things in English. Now, I would understand, somewhat because I think it's stupid either way, that it could be frustrating for him to have a foreign language spoken at his table if he didn't understand it himself. But we knew that he could speak, understand, and read English because that's the only information he sent us. The player's manual was in English, and on top of that, we never spoke to him in English ever, only to each other as it had become a habit for us. His DMing style was just him telling us what to do all the time, and his superiority complex eventually tired me out. I lasted 3 sessions of having him reminding us every 10 minutes how great French was and how lucky we were to live in a beautiful French area, and getting annoyed if the words of English were said, which, again, our character sheets were also in English, by the way. Anyways, looking back on this now, it feels so incredibly stupid and pointless. Clearly, he had issues. I did not engage again with D&D for 2 years until I started watching videos and live streams of people playing TTRPGs, and now I run my own homebrew TTRPG with friends, Haley included, and I run them in English, with French or any other language comments absolutely welcomed at my table.
I'm just going to get this out of the way. As an English person, this guy is inciting violence. On a more serious note, my main D&D group is entirely Swedish other than one other person, and they all speak English for just me and that other person, because they all speak perfect English. This DM getting offended at them shifting into another language that everyone at the table can understand is just snobbery. It would only be bad if there was someone at the table who couldn't understand the language.
Well, and it didn't even sound like they were speaking English, hoping that everybody else would speak English. It was just when they were like discussing things between themselves, they just sort of have this French-English combo that they always spoke to each other. So it wasn't like it even affected the DM. Clearly just had some issues here.
That's pretty common for people who are bilingual when their second language is English. They will just insert the English word for something.
Yeah, no, it happens all the time. My dad worked with a Vietnamese guy that he would like talk to his wife on the phone, and every once in a while, random English words, because it was just easier, because they both spoke the language, to use certain English words instead of having to say it in Vietnamese. You know, create sort of your own language with the people that you speak it the most.
Absolutely. It's only a problem if it's exclusionary to someone at the table. If someone didn't speak it, it could be an excellent substitute for a secondary character language.
100%.
Hey man,
Hey, what?
what do you call a skeleton with a Nobel Prize?
I don't know. What do you call a skeleton with a Nobel Prize?
A bona fide genius. That joke was submitted to us by Street Fighter Fan 77 again. If you have a joke you'd like to read, you can email it to us in the email in the description or submit it in the comments, or send your story, or send any potential horror stories to the email address as well. And with that, we have definitely not been two kobolds in a trench coat. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and make the necessary sacrifices to Tiamat. We'll see you next time.